I think this case around what happened in the Blanchardstown Steakhouse, where Jason Hennessy Snr was killed, as was Tristan Sherry, the gunman, is a real. It shows, when you dig down into the special criminal court, the areas that it's concerned with. So you've got a 3-judge sitting there. They can't be influenced or shouldn't be influenced by anything other than the facts that are put before them and the law around it. And actually, the case is really interesting because, of course, the murder itself, Tristan Sherry and another gunman came into that restaurant on Christmas Eve and opened fire on Jason Hennessy Snr, who lunged at Sherry before they collapsed to the ground, and then other members of his party who were out eating a meal basically stabbed Sherry to death, 16 stab wounds. So you have all these sort of individuals involved in quite a chaotic moment. So I suppose the court has to consider a lot of things. Firstly, and in this case, it's the age of the 2 accused, which we'll come to in a minute. But they've had to look at whether self-defense was in play, because Tristan Sherry obviously was a perpetrator and a victim in this crime. So he was, they found in many of the cases, he wasn't, they weren't acting in self-defense because he was sort of, on the ground and had been knocked over and stabbed by the point in time when they were claiming self-defense. So that we've been through in a few of the cases. There's also something I wanted to tell you about, which came up in Eamon's trial there, he was covering. We talked about homicide and why they were upgrading Mike Gaines' investigation to a homicide. Was it a new American word they were using or what? Homicide covers, according to Eamon, murder, manslaughter and self-defense.
Unlawful killing, effectively,
So it covers all of them. So in actual fact, I suppose, if you're going by the book, all investigations into someone dead, presumed killed unlawfully, should be a homicide investigation as opposed to a murder investigation.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I suppose it's a technical term that hasn't generally been used in Ireland. When you come to court, I mean, homicide isn't something, but it's a descriptive term. It's totally valid to be used in the context of a Garda investigation. Yeah, I mean, the Brown Steakhouse case is huge. Like, it had huge impacts, obviously, in terms of the situation in gangland in Dublin. But I suppose it does also highlight a couple of things, how Ireland is changing and has had very, very significant changes in how young offenders are being dealt with in these serious cases. And we're seeing the outworking, I suppose, of decisions made by the Supreme Court that are now coming into effect. It was obviously people will remember that case because it was an act of sheer terror, really, to go into a packed restaurant on Christmas Eve and start opening fire. And obviously this all happened in plain sight of other people who were just
videos and all taken of people sort of fleeing for what they thought was their lives. They didn't know what was happening, with children and all the rest of it. This latest development in it, and it's coming from the special criminal court and covered by Owen Reynolds, the journalist. But basically, these 2 of the defendants, they were so young. I remember initially when they were being arrested and brought before the courts, we were like, "Oh my God, they're so young." But 2 of them were so young. They were 17 at the time. They were underage. One of them was on the cusp of becoming 18, and that was, of course, David Amah, who has been convicted of murder, along with this other 18-year-old who still cannot be named because by the time he was brought before the courts, he was still underage.
Yeah.
He was a minor as such. But there was the Supreme Court ruling was that if they were convicted of murder, they were not to be given the mandatory life sentence unless it was discovered there was an amount of premeditation.
Yeah, except what's described as exceptional circumstances in a judgment. So this judgment came out of a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where a woman originally from Mongolia was brutally stabbed by a 14-year-old boy in Dublin city centre. People might remember the case. So ultimately, because he was convicted of murder, he was given a mandatory life sentence. That has been the law in Ireland. It doesn't matter whether you plead guilty doesn't matter what age you are, doesn't matter if you're a man, doesn't matter if you're a woman. Once you're convicted of murder, you get this mandatory life sentence. And what that means is it doesn't put a particular tariff. It doesn't say you have to spend 20 years in prison or 30 years in prison. It just means that you're sentenced to life, and it's at the discretion of the state effectively when you're let out. And even when you do get let out, you're still on this life tariff, and you can be you're basically controlled and subjected to. If you, for example, get in trouble, you can be brought back into prison. So this case came to the Supreme Court, and it's basically said because this crime was committed by a 14-year-old in this case, that it was unconstitutional that they be given a mandatory life sentence. It doesn't take into account their age. We have seen over the years, for example, in other cases where people they have this review built into them. Judges give, say, the 13, 14-year-old is given a mandatory life sentence, but there is a review built into it. And it was found that wasn't constitutional effectively. So that's where we get to with this, that they're but it's changing. That decision came earlier this year, and we can already see it being played out in the case David Amah and the other man who's not named.
And Amah's sentence was 12 years with the final 3 suspended. And he was sentenced by Justice Karida Naidu. And he basically referred to the probation report for both of them, which put them at low risk of reoffending. And he noted that there was no level of premeditation in this whatsoever. Yeah. None of them brought weapons with them. So to picture that scene, of course, they're out for a Christmas Eve dinner and they have no idea anything's going to kick off here at all whatsoever. They've ordered their meals, they're enjoying a drink, whatever. They're out to celebrate. And in bursts Sherry and another gunman. So from their point of view, they reacted to a situation. I think this has been noted by the judge in regard to the sentencing of both. They behaved in a way that, has to be punished so as to deter others in the misguided belief that, any sort of violence can be justified. But they didn't bring their weapons with them. They basically grabbed. Where did the weapon?
Well, I mean,
clearly they're in a restaurant, so they will have access to knives.
Exactly. I mean, in fact, what the new law says is that a minor can only be convicted, given a life sentence, if it can be shown that in exceptional circumstances where the intentions and actions can be fairly equated to those of an adult. So that implies that if somebody, has a sort of adult reasoning, has, premeditation, as you said, that clearly, in this case, doesn't follow. I mean, those people didn't go out with the intention.
Well, what the judge referred to was evidence of premeditation, obviously, luring, exploitation of known vulnerabilities in somebody, attempts to conceal guilt, sexual violence, particularly brutal violence. In the case of both of them, Sherry was actually disarmed and on the ground at the time that they committed their offences. And Amah stamped on him and stabbed him using a knife that was handed to him, presumably from that restaurant. I'm presuming this is a steak knife. You're in a steakhouse. And following that initial attack, he then videoed himself stomping on Sherry. But while the violence was serious and brutal, they certainly had nothing planned whatsoever in regards to doing this or to this situation playing out in front of them.
No.
So, yes. So you have, they did put forward, many of the accused in this case did put forward that they were defending themselves. That didn't work for them because of the CCTV footage, which did show clearly when he was disarmed, Sherry.
When he was killed, at the point at which he's killed, he was disarmed, he was on the ground, and nobody was at risk. So the self-defense might have, if they committed violence in disarming him and maybe knocked him to the ground, they would probably not have been criminally prosecuted. What happened was that he was obviously, he'd been injured. He was on the ground. He was no longer a threat. And at that point, he was killed. And that's where the criminal culpability, I suppose, comes into it in this case.
And let's just go through the others and what has happened to them. Are these the final 2 in this.
They're the final two,
the
yeah.
final two. So Brandon Hennessy, who would be a son of Jason Hennessy Snr, who was killed in this attack. He hit Sherry with a brush. Again, something he grabbed from the crime scene
Yeah.
they were in. And that was again while he was disarmed, and he was not acting in self-defense. He took on board his previous convictions and accepted, while the killing of his father in front of his eyes, I suppose, was a mitigating factor. He did sentence him to 4.5 years, the last 6 months suspended. Then there's a Jonas Kabangu, he's 19, and he received a sentence of 4 years in prison with the final 12 months suspended for 2 years. And there was the 18-year-old who can't be named was also sentenced to violent disorder previous to this murder conviction. This is a second
I think so, yeah.
underage individual. So he has been sentenced to 2 years and 4 months, the final year suspended. It's all over and done with fairly quickly.
Yeah. But I mean, the impact of this killing goes on.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we can't discuss, but it certainly had a huge impact on what happens in the criminal underworld in that part of North Dublin. Over the last, since this case has occurred, the guards have been on the ground constantly. There's been a constant stream of incidents, particularly, there's been attempt at murder, but there's been lots of arson attacks. There's been lots of intimidation, and it goes on and on. I suppose you can see it came and got dealt with very quickly. You can see that the Supreme Court is not as busy as it was, as many of the Kinna and Hutch cases have come to an end. But it's still a very, very volatile situation with a lot of volatile people involved.
Now, in that regard, Detective Superintendent Paul Murphy did make a statement outside the court, and he reassured the public and those people living in the greater Blanchardstown area that the guards don't tolerate organised criminal behaviour and are working every day to sort of keep people safe. I think there was that the violence that continues is being
contained. I mean, it is
contained to a certain extent. And usually what you find is in these situations, you can identify a handful of very volatile characters who are the leaders of kind of probably younger, naive and more vulnerable types who will do their bidding. But if they can lock up or in some way even get them off the streets, even on a traffic offence, some people, they can really calm the situation down. And it does break up and people get a little bit older, even over a few years. I mean, these guys are so young.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, as we did recently, we did podcasts obviously on Glenmore, Mr. Flashy being put behind bars. And I said at the time, I got an email just from some listener saying, well, Finglas has just been a lot quieter since he was originally taken into custody, and he was taken into custody on a violent disorder charge at some point as well. So, just even removing somebody like Glenn Ward from the streets, even he's got a 5-year sentence, it's not going to take him off the streets forever, but it has a notable impact. And obviously Glenn Ward, Mr. Flashy, was a very good pal of Tristan Sherry. I mean, they're he was his associate, and may have played a role in a lot of this feuding that goes on. So people often say to us, like, what's the difference? You put one behind bars, another one will spring up. But it does genuinely make a difference to the people living in that area for that period of time. Of course, taking one or two individuals off is not going to solve a societal problem, but it does make a difference. And the guards have to be congratulated, because it's a kind of a sprawling area, that part of North Dublin, and a hard area to police.
When you talk about their top targets, I mean, they are individuals that usually can't be named. I mean, actually, it brings us very nicely to the case of Patrick Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, but Mr. Fishy, where did that come from?
Well, I always thought he was called Fishy Fitzgerald. I don't know if he's Mr. Fishy. I'm not denying. I think it's the guards who said Mr. Fishy. But
okay, so they got it wrong.
But no, I'd say they've got it right.
Well, Fishy Fitzgerald sounds a bit. So he's 48, okay?
Yeah.
And he is the guy who provided the getaway car used by the organised crime gang and the attempted murder of Gary
Carey.
The Canary Carey. We'll get to these nicknames in a while. But when he was out on bail, he terrorised a family.
Yeah, I mean, a very horrific case. Aggravated burglary. He ultimately gets serving a 7.5-year sentence for that. But I mean, Fishy Fitzgerald has been, he's been actually named. I look back on it in the Sunday World, we had him just as Fishy, a gangster known as Fishy, for over, I think it was the first story was a story by Alan Sherry back in 2011. So he's been a prime target for Gardaí in the Finglas area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this guy is not probably, that kind of elite level of criminal, but he's somebody who has been involved in criminal activity pretty much steadily for over 2 decades. He was part of
He challenges your theory, by the way, that they kind of eventually run out of steam. 48 years of age.
48 years of age and still, still up to at a high level. I mean, he was suspected of being part of an armed robbery gang, really, that I think they counted in sort of maybe 2000 or 2009, 2010, that they were involved in sort of 40 armed raids across Dublin and Meath. Probably at that time there was more money to be made. He would have been on the fringes of sort of the Aim and Don gang, would have been associating with them, but was kind of separate. But has been involved in a constant sort of levels of low level feuding, really, in that Finglas area. The Gary Carey, obviously Gary Carey ultimately was shot dead, but there was an attempt.
It was in 21.
Yeah, but there was an attempt on his life before he was killed.
Yeah.
And Fishy Fitzgerald basically sourced the car. I mean, I think the belief is that he wasn't personally involved in any particular feud, but really carried it out for money. You can see Gary Carey would ultimately be killed, but at that time, Fishy Fitzgerald was in prison, so he's not a suspect in that murder at all. But you can see the connections across Dublin and how different people are used to carry out different roles.
Carey had moved to Spain after that, with the family. Then he moved back. And was he followed into a car park of a hotel in Kilmainham?
He was followed into a car park in Kilmainham. I mean, Gary Carey was also a significant criminal. I mean, if you look at the level he was at, I suppose he was one step below the big guys. He had been involved with all sorts of criminal organisations, but really kind of operated on his own. He certainly would have had very deep connections with the family organisation at one stage. He also would have been involved with other sort of gangs in Ballyfermot, including the Kinahans, or maybe the Kinahan wing in West Dublin. He was kind of, I suppose, he'd been a target for CAB. As had Fishy Fitzgerald at one point in a much lesser role, had 47,000 taken off him. But he had fallen out with really people in operating in the Ballyfermot area, and was taken out.
In his defence, actually, Bernard Condon, I'm sure he doesn't call him Fishy Fitzgerald, but we'll continue on that.
Or Mr.
Anyway.
Fishy, whatever.
Said he had difficulties with drugs in his past. He was brought up by his sister because both his parents died.
Yeah.
He worked for a period of time as a pot washer before he began, quote, to drift, and his difficulties with drugs began in his late 20s.
Yeah.
He did come off drugs for a period and got clean, but then obviously he relapsed. So he is relating all his issues to his own drug use, basically. And he said that Fitzgerald is doing well in prison, attempting to turn his life around again.
Very good. I mean, of course, his name continues to pop up in Finglas because we had this, people will remember the pipe bomb attack that was brought by a drone. And again, a very close associate of Fishy was being targeted in that way. So his associates remain involved in the kind of the fallout from the Mr. Flashy jailing and the collapse of that sort of criminal organisation. He continues to some of his closest associates are still popping up on the radar. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.